April 12th, 1861 marked the beginning of the Civil War. The next 4 years would mark the bloodiest war in U.S. history. The main conflict was between the North and the South over many topics, one of them, slavery. Over the course of the next 4 years, there have been many conflicts, not just between the North and South, but within the North and South themselves. In the North, the main conflict was chiefly over the conscription and the draft. In the South, however, the issue was mainly over natural resources. The conflict in the North reached its climax when a riot exploded and continued for 5 days in New York City. The events leading up to the riot are extremely crucial events, not just in the Civil War, but also in the history of the United States. The Industrial Revolution, beginning of the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Enrollment Act all contributed to the beginning of the riot. However, the real cause of the riot and dissent were the social, economic, and racial inequalities before and during the war. These inequalities, accentuated by the events described before, were the real cause of the riots. The riot, mainly focused on the issue of drafts into the U.S. military, would have a lasting impact on the future of U.S. wars. The economic and racial inequalities will continue until the mid-1900s.
They have killed Negroes there. A crowd is here and are going to destroy this station.
Many factors that led to the riots. The main contributor was the economic inequality between the wealthy and the poor. Let's rewind and go back way before the beginning of the Civil War. The economic inequality started from the Industrial Revolution beginning in the 1700s and early 1800s. When the Industrial Revolution arrived to the U.S., mostly in the Northeast, the fundamentals of social classes changed forever. The Industrial Revolution introduced the U.S. citizens to a harsh structure where some thrived and some were crushed. The lower working class was stuck in factories with very harsh working conditions and long, hard working hours with minimum wages. The lower working class suffered, while the upper class thrived. The factory and industry owners made large amounts of money exporting and importing finished goods throughout the U.S. and other countries around the world. This gap continued to worsen through the period of the Civil War. In big northern cities such as New York City, immigrants flooded and saturated the working lower class even more, which made the gap even larger. Now, this marks the beginning of the hostilities between the lower and upper class. Keep this in mind throughout the rest of the video.
What is your current job?
I'm a factory worker. I make textiles.
Were you drafted into the Civil War?
No, I wasn't drafted. But all my friends, my brothers, they are all drafted into the war.
What is your occupation?
I work as a factory owner. Many people say I don't work and I just boss people around.
It's true.
It's not. Get back to work, you peasant. April 12th, 1861 marked the beginning of the Civil War after the events of Fort Sumner in South Carolina. The tensions between the North and South had reached its boiling point, and both sides were now locked in a war both sides thought would be over quickly. After the Battle of Fort Sumner, President Lincoln ordered a proclamation of 75,000 volunteers to fight the South in this new war. Like many others, he thought the war would be a quick one. Initially, both sides thought that the war would be over quickly, claiming that an easy victory over each other. However, they did not realize that the war would be the bloodiest 4 years in the history of the United States. As the war dragged on, the troop requirements simply could not be met by the volunteers. The war dragged on for 2 more years until 1863. It was lasting longer than anyone had anticipated, and they simply needed more men. To meet the demands of the war, President Lincoln issued an Enrollment Act of 1863. It was a compulsory draft in which the men were selected randomly, and they had to serve in the army, except for a few exceptions. Now keep this in mind and let's move on to the next event. Emancipation Proclamation is a historic speech that marks a historic era and a new beginning in the history of the United States. On January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln gave the now famous speech which freed 3.1 million out of 4 million slaves in the United States. The proclamation made it clear that at that point, the war was about slavery. However, the proclamation was only in effect in rebellious states, meaning that only the slaves in southern rebelling states are freed. The consequences and effects of the proclamation were huge. The one we will focus on today is the social and economic inequalities due to the emancipation. Around three-fourths of the whole nation's slaves had been freed. Most of the slaves in the South seek to go north, mainly to find protection and work if they could. The North was mostly anti-slavery and home of many abolitionists. However, a few opposed emancipation for a few different reasons. The North, mainly the Northeast, was filled with the lower working class. They were already struggling through the low wages and harsh working and living conditions. Now, about 3 million slaves had just been freed and are looking for work. Most of them go up north to find work, and the work they will most likely to be able to get is factory work, and the work of the lower working class that makes up for most of the population is in the north. Many of the North feared that their work will be taken by African Americans after they had been freed. This contributed to the hostilities and even more difference between the lower and working class and the freed slaves.
Why do you think the lower white class was so upset with the Enrollment Act?
I mean, first of all, they were too poor to pay the $300 exemption fee, and they could not hire a substitute. And recently, by the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln, the African Americans were basically freed in the rebelling states, and they would come up north. And so think about it from their perspective. After the African Americans are recently freed and the war is over, they would come home and possibly take the work of the poor working class in the northern states. So why would a poor factory worker go fight for a war for people who would possibly take their work? So unless you're an abolitionist, why would you want to fight for someone who's going to take your work?
On March 3, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed and passed the Enrollment Act of 1863. It required that all white male citizens between the age of 20 and 45 had to serve in the military if they were selected. However, one could avoid being drafted into the Army if they paid a $300 exemption fee or if they found a substitute. Now this was hugely controversial part of the Enrollment Act. The fact that one could avoid being drafted into the Army by paying or finding a replacement angered a lot of the Northerners, especially the lower working class. The lower working class was so upset because they could not afford to pay the exemption fee. Only the rich could, and they thought this was extremely unfair. By passing the Enrollment Act of 1863, many called the rich man's war or the poor man's fight. This further encouraged the hostilities between the lower and upper class.
Why are you so upset with the Conscription Act?
The Conscription Act is the worst thing the government has done this entire war. It's not fair.
What do you mean?
Rich people, people with money, they can get out of going to the war. They can pay for substitutes or just pay to get out. But all the poor people, we're stuck to fight.
I mean, you said you can find a substitute.
It's still not fair. Everyone should be treated equally. This is America.
Were you drafted into the war?
Of course not. I could easily pay the $300 fee, but all my workers were. Now I have to exploit the remaining workers that I have even more. My life is terrible.
Do you think the current system is fair?
Of course. Why would the rich have to go and fight? That makes no sense. We're too busy running the country. Without us, the country would go down the drain. People should be thankful that we even stay and support the economy. Instead of going out and fighting, my factory, like as many other factories out there, make the guns and for the soldiers that work in the Union. The idea that the rich don't support the war is preposterous.
What exactly is the Enrollment Act?
The Enrollment Act was a federal draft law passed by the government of the United States during the Civil War on March 3rd, 1863.
Why was the Enrollment Act necessary?
It was partly necessary because the Union simply needed more soldiers. In the beginning of the war, the military was mostly made out of volunteers, but as the war dragged on, they needed more men. So the Enrollment Act required men from ages 20 to 45 to serve in the military.
What's the significance of the Enrollment Act?
The significance of the Enrollment Act is that it was the first wartime draft in the history of the United States where it required all men who were drafted to go into military service.
On Saturday, July 11th, 1863, the first draftees were picked and announced. Nothing seemed to happen until Monday morning on the 13th, but this marked the beginning of the riots. On Monday morning, July 13th, 1863, the tension between the poor, the rich, and the blacks reached a boiling point. Around 7 a.m., a riot broke out and would continue for the next 3 days. The mob was mostly consisted of Irish immigrants in the lower class. There were thousands of people rioting, including men, women, and even children. Thousands of people rioted and basically destroyed the city in the 5 days that followed. They destroyed private property, buildings, docks, stores, factories, and more. On the morning of the third day, the primary target were government offices and buildings. They attacked anyone who got in their way. However, by late afternoon, the mob started targeting the blacks. They wanted to get rid of the blacks in the city. The blacks were not drafted into the war, at least not at this time, and they were the competition for work. The mob attacked any of the African Americans that they came across. They even attacked hospitals and asylums that held black children, wounded, and the sick. Many blacks were lynched, mutilated, killed, and sometimes even raped. The mob did not want any competition for their work and wanted all the blacks out of the city. They even attacked some of the white business owners who hired or housed black workers. By the river, a man named William Jones was hanged and burned. Charles Jackson was beaten and nearly drowned to death. Jeremiah Johnson was beaten to death with his body thrown into the river. All three men were black and were victims of the riots. These are just some of the various specific examples of black men that were killed or injured in the war. In total, 11 black men were hanged and many more were killed or injured. The riot occurred throughout the whole city. Many blacks were killed and many more fled the city fearing for their lives. However, the blacks were not the only target of the mobs. Many of the targets were the rich as well. The houses of the rich were attacked, destroyed, or vandalized. The riot continued for 4 more days until the U.S. military, troops, police, and militia had to interfere and stop the riot. The riot is considered one of the most bloodiest riots in the history of the United States. Around 120 people were killed, mostly black men, and thousands of blacks fled the city. The draft riots are not only local to New York City, but there were also many different draft riots in the northern states at different times, such as the Indiana, Illinois, and other cities in New York, such as Albany.
As you know, many of the lower class factory workers feel that the current system is unfair. Do you feel like this is the case, and have you been a victim of many riots that occurred?
Like I said before, the system is completely fair. Anyone in opposition is ignorant or jealous that they did not work hard enough to get the money that I have. And funny that you asked, a peasant came up to me earlier after work today and threw a rock at me. It's really upsetting that people don't understand how much I work for this country.
And how do you think this is going to affect the workforce after the war?
As long as we have a continuous flow of workers, I believe that their industry will survive and flourish in the future.
Shortly after the draft riot, the city was noticeably white dominant. However, this would soon change. The Enrollment Act had to be temporarily suspended due to the extreme opposition until a later date. It was suspended, but 2 years later, it was amended into the Enrollment Act of 1865. This new amendment was received with much less opposition than the previous act and did not incur riots throughout the North. The significance of the riots is that it marked a clear distinction between the white working class and the black working class. It also marked the distinction between the poor and the wealthy. The riots outlined many of the major issues in the United States, including social, economic, and racial inequalities. Many people noticed the clear distinctions and tried to fix them. Unions were created in order to encourage and urge better and fair wages for the poor working class. Schools were established for blacks who were eager to learn and work. There were black workforces, although at a later timeline they urged for hiring blacks for work. Many people and groups worked to fix the problems that contributed to the draft riots. Union League Club, which was 7 months old, and the Committee of the Merchants for the Relief of Colored People worked to improve and protect the lives of African Americans in the city. They helped raise money for the struggling families. They worked hard to find new jobs for the affected blacks and tried to bridge the gap between blacks and white. Now we know the events leading up to the riot and that it was caused by social, economic, and racial inequalities in the North, more specifically, New York City. The riot may have damaged the relationship between the whites and the blacks at the time, but the effort to fix it and improve put us forward in many years. Many different aspects of the social life changed due to the riot. Working and living conditions of the power class improved as well as the wages. Black men were allowed to work and be educated at special schools, and the first step towards economic and racial equality had been taken, although it will not reach its peak until the mid 1900s. U.S. economy will thrive even more after the war and the riots, and the welfare of the people for both white and blacks improved.